Okay, we're about to go live right now. This is Anthony Rodriguez on behalf of the Texas Southern University School of Public Affairs. I'm just going to welcome in to the set to start our program today with the convener. I'm as a co-convener, Dr. Gary Bledsoe. He is coming to you now.
Okay. Dr. Rodriguez, thank you so much for all the great work you've done for Texas Southern University and for the tremendous work you've done in helping to put on this conference. Today, my good friends, we are celebrating Emancipation Day, and we're trying to bring it full circle in a number of ways I think that are relevant to the discussion that's occurring in the world today. And we have some tremendous speakers that are here to try to bring perspective on the issue. I know that it's always been of great interest to me, even as a lawyer. I was one of the lawyers that has actually brought a reparations lawsuit. So we have a great deal of information that'll be relevant to our young people who might be considering careers in law. You can consider careers in becoming a litigator, a legislator, or a policymaker. There are many careers that would be available, and we're hoping this will be valuable to you. And besides that, we hope it's really valuable to the world as we help facilitate the discussion in terms of what to do about racism in the world, what to do about racism in the country. We know that this very week there was a debate regarding racism involving the United Nations. So not only has that debate taken place in this country, and as we see the marches and protests in this country against anti-Black racism, we've seen those kinds of marches all around the world. So there's wide recognition about racism directed against persons of African descent, whether they be in Europe, whether they be in the Caribbean, whether they be in South, Central, or North America. So I think there's such a wide scale. And I know we're going to have a welcoming from our president. We're very proud of the great job that Mr. Hewitt has done, President Hewitt has done at Texas Southern University. He's come in under difficult circumstances with COVID-19 and all of those circumstances, and really done such a tremendous job in trying to bring cohesiveness and focus to the university, to make the university all that it can be. So we're so glad to see that he's working and actually coming in and putting his life at risk and doing things to help the people of this university and the people of our great state. So we're glad to have him to come and do a welcome, and we're very proud of our provost, who I think has such great leadership skills as well. As we know, he's got a background in the United States military and has really demonstrated that while he's been here at Texas Southern University, trying to bring all of us up shipshape to do good things for the university. Dr. Rodriguez, are we ready for
We'll be ready for the provost, the president in a second. I need everyone to go ahead and turn their cameras back on. All the cameras went off simultaneously. So could everyone turn their cameras back on? Okay, good. Okay, Professor. Okay, great, great. The president video is slightly delayed. So can you go ahead and introduce the guests? The president video is showing a playback problem right now. We tested it as a playback problem. We are still looking for the provost. So if you can go ahead and introduce your guest, who's here right now.
Sure, I'll introduce the guests, and so they will wait for the president. And I've got some other remarks in reference to the conference and Juneteenth that I wanted to bring as well. So let me say that. Our first panel is a tremendous panel. We've got Dr. Vernon Burton, the nation's preeminent authority on Lincoln, You might go and see the website of the Age of Lincoln whenever February comes around. We always see Dr. Burton on C-SPAN. He is really one of the go-to persons for the Smithsonian. When the United States Congress was considering renewing the Voting Rights Act in 2006, he was one of the individuals invited as an expert. And I've actually seen him in action. I've had him as an expert witness of mine and seen him work for other lawyers as an expert. He's indeed a wealth of knowledge in terms of the history of this nation, and will bring a lot of information to bear that's relevant to the issue of whether or not there might be reparations or a need for reconciliation in this country. And you know that you can sometimes run on parallel tracks because the issues relating to African Americans in this country really, in many ways, parallel things that have occurred to persons of African descent around the world. And we know that Africa has many issues that are similar in terms of the economic conditions, et cetera, that affect persons that live on that continent. We're so glad to have one of the co-sponsors for an initiative to join or improve relations between HBCUs and predominantly black serving institutions in this country with Africa and the Caribbean. And that's Dr. Ayodele Odusula. And he's coming with us all the way from South Africa, where he is now deployed as a member of the United Nations Department of Programs African Bureau, and we're so glad to see him here. And it's really late in the day for him there, and so we really appreciate him actually coming on. So we won't have to interrupt them. Let me mention a couple things about Juneteenth that I think that are relevant. And Dr. Rodriguez, let me know whenever the president is the video is ready.
Let me see if I can assist you to get in. You're.
Excuse me, Dr. Rodriguez, were you? Okay. The Texas seceded from Mexico because
yes, ma'am.
Texas seceded from Mexico because Texans
my phone be on ready and waiting for you. That is fine.
Okay. Dr. Rodriguez, we can. Were you saying you wanted to do the video? I'm needing to know if I need to defer to you at this point.
No,
Dr. Rodriguez,
you just that'd be fine. Just okay. That'd be fine. Just reach out, and we'll bring you in. Okay.
Okay.
Lovely. Take care. Bye bye.
Okay.
Yes, but it's changing like slightly. So,
Dr. Rodriguez, did you know? I think everyone.
Yes, I will organize this once I get a quick break. I'll organize and send it to you. Okay. Lovely. Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay. Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez, can you hear me? Dr. Rodriguez.
Hey, Tamara.
Dr. Rodriguez. Okay. Okay. Dr. Rodriguez, can you hear me? Dr. Rodriguez. Okay. Dr. Rodriguez. Okay. I'm gonna go and continue, guys. I apologize to everyone who is looking in. The Texas seceded from Mexico so that it could own slaves. It became part of the Union. So there's a great history in this state in regards to that. We know that President Lincoln decided he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. He gave a warning to the southern states, and when they didn't accede or adhere to his warning on January 1st, 1863, he actually issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, but word of the Emancipation Proclamation reached a number of southern states, but it did not reach Texas for the most part until June 19th, 1865. That's significant because General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th of 1865. So Texas fought for 2.5 months longer than others, continuing to fight the nation. And we do know that even after Texas became independent, General Grant had to send in special troops because of the hostility in this state. Texas became or adopted Juneteenth as a holiday back in 1980, when an alum of this university, Al Edwards, actually introduced legislation that ended up passing the Texas legislature. And we have today. We're going to have also in the first panel. We're going to have Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Okay, if I can interject very quickly, my apologies, everyone. I told I had an open mic a few minutes ago. My apologies for it. That was the Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee calling me, indicating she's been called to a special session today, which she'll be part of, and she would not be able to be in the first session as planned. But I think you probably heard me say we've tried to accommodate her during the day, but she will call back during the proceedings of the day, and we will send her an agenda. So my apologies for the open mic, and we do have the introduction from the president, so I can bring it to you at some given time.
Okay. Why don't we give me about 60 seconds to finalize this part? Then
Lovely.
Let's play the video, and then we'll go with our panelists and allow Mr. Davis to.
We'll bring Mr. Davis in, and we have space for, since the Congresswoman is not in, I'll send Mr. Davis a link, and the provost can come in whenever we see him. He'll give his welcome. There's space for everyone. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So today we're going to discuss H.R. 40, Congressman Jackson Lee's reparations bill, as well as H.R. 992, Congressman Green's bill, in reference to reconciliation. So I think those things are very relevant and important. And today, as we discuss George Floyd, we know that the discussion about reparations is extremely important. So with that, I'm hoping that this will be illuminating because we have the distinguished scholars on the first panel. We have members of Congress who are going to be coming up immediately after. And we have the former ambassador for the African Union, the dean of the Jordan Leland School of Public Affairs, the graduate dean, the individual from Dr. Terry from Morgan State, that's really the leader in terms of partnership between HBCUs and Africa to talk about the things they have there. Dr. Fareed Muhammad, who's led the effort to try to coordinate activities, and member of our Board of Regents, who's really going to have some exciting news for us today with all the great things that the Board of Regents is considering doing here at the university. So, and I think with that, Dr. Rodriguez, if you can hear me, I think it would be
okay. Lovely. We have a welcome coming to you from our president, President Kenneth Hewitt. He's our interim president. He has been caught in a great time where he's demonstrating the ability to lead us even in the midst of COVID-19, George Floyd, and everything else we're seeing. So here's our president giving a welcome. Doctor, you can proceed.
Yeah,
Take your time. Okay. No, there's something showing at the top of your screen.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
We good? Am I looking at the camera?
Yeah, just look straight ahead. And you're looking great. Just like that. That's perfect right here. And we have TSC in the background. Yeah, excellent.
You ready?
I'm ready. Okay, I wasn't sure if the video came out correctly, so I stopped the video. Professor Bledsoe?
Okay.
I terminated the video
So
because the video, it didn't seem to, was the video working correctly?
It showed the president actually setting up and getting prepared.
Okay, so let's hold off on the video. Let me just try to get started the right place. So let's continue with the talk. I'll bring in Cedric right now. Okay, where's Mr. Cedric? Okay, here's Cedric. Okay, he should be here shortly for you.
Okay. Doc, I think it probably. Why don't you? I'll know when he comes in. Is it going to take a while? I think the viewers probably would want us to go ahead and get started here, so we can um, move forward. I guess here. The Is he coming in? I don't see him as yet, so I'm looking for him. Okay. Okay. Why don't we, if we might, because Cedric can come in and get started with this. But I've introduced our two guests who are very distinguished, and I know that I would like to ask Dr. Burton to start, and I want everyone to know that he is indeed one of the preeminent scholars on American history and race. I am probably just as anxious as he is for a book he's writing now with Armin Derfner, a great voting rights litigator. They're writing a book on race and the Supreme Court. Dr. Burton has been cited on a number of occasions by the United States Supreme Court. He's indeed well recognized. He was even cited in a case he worked with us back in 2003 or 4. So indeed, he has really got great accolades, but I think among the voting rights community, he's known as really kind of a godsend in many, many ways. His expert reports, if you saw the opinion of the judge in the voter identification case that we were involved in, it quoted him extensively. Indeed, he's well recognized, and as I said before, the United States Congress invited him as one of a very select group of experts to testify to them about the conditions of voting rights affecting people of color in this nation to determine whether or not to extend the Voting Rights Act back in 2006. So let's welcome the Clemson University, formerly of the University of Illinois, a great friend of the African American community throughout, and my good friend, Dr. Orville Burton.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for lowering expectations. Can you hear me okay? This is great. Well, I'm a historian, and this is Juneteenth. And since we're virtually in Texas, my friend Gary asked me to take just a few moments to look at this historic date of Juneteenth. It was just a couple of days ago, New York and Virginia announced that they are doing state holidays for Juneteenth. It was just 2 weeks after President Lincoln's announcement on September the 22nd, 1862, of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Union forces abandoned Galveston, Texas. Now, for the 250,000 enslaved people in Texas, the loss of this Union toehold was a disaster for their hopes of freedom. Many had been there, in fact, when the Union was there in Galveston. Instead, having a nearby refuge to flee to, as most other states offered, particularly east of the Mississippi, African-American Texas would really have to depend on the military developments outside of Texas to eventually deliver emancipation. Federal forces once again landed in Galveston. They finally reestablished constitutional authority in Texas on June 18, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, had declared the enslaved persons forever free in rebel-controlled Texas. And after the assassination of Lincoln in 1865, in June, Andrew Johnson, a committed racist and white supremacist, was now president instead of Lincoln. The next day, June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger stepped out on the balcony of the Aston Villa, a home that had previously served as a headquarters for the rebel army in the region all throughout the war. And he read General Orders Number 3. And I'm quoting now from the order: the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Ever since this momentous declaration, June 19th has been celebrated as Emancipation Day in Texas with the unique and distinctive label of Juneteenth. Typical celebrations of Texas Emancipation Day will include readings of the Emancipation Proclamations, one of my favorite Texas cultural traditions, barbecue, dancing, singing, and poetry recitations, as the day grew into a wider celebration of Black culture in Texas. The great migration of the 20th century of Black Texans to the Midwest and California helped spread the holiday to new regions of the country. After a century of observance by the state's African-American population, and you all, I assume, know about Emancipation Park, bought with the scarce resources of African-Americans, and a renewed push for civil rights in the 1950s and 1960, as Gary mentioned, because I'm an alum of Southern Texas University, the Texas legislature officially made Juneteenth a state holiday in 1980. Today, the holiday remains one of the many reminders of the complex history of emancipation and freedom in the United States. One lesson we want to look at today is especially important for us, and that is, like the Emancipation Proclamation, laws do not matter unless they are enforced, and that's true today as it was in 1863, in 1865, 1954, 1964, and 1965. Laws do matter, but how they interpret it is essential to freedom, especially for minorities. Now, related to Juneteenth, I often ask students, when did slavery end in the United States? Now, if they answered 1865 with the 13th Amendment, that's not really correct. But the 13th Amendment, though adopted in 1865, was virtually stillborn for a century. Instead, there were Black codes, disfranchisement, segregations, and all the trappings of Jim Crow. A better date, I think, for the end of slavery is a century after its adoption, specifically 1968. By that time, the Supreme Court had outlawed segregation, and Congress had acted against disenfranchisement, as well as given sanction to laws against discrimination in hotels and restaurants, employment, and housing. When my friend, civil rights attorney Armin Durfner, together asked me to work with him on something we had been talking about ever since we were expert, and I was his expert witness beginning in 1980. I have been working on this book on race in the Supreme Court's due, Gary, out from Harvard University Press this May, and I promise to send you the first copy that I get. In 1968, the case of Jones v. Alfred H. Mayer Company highlighted these events when the Supreme Court brought the 13th Amendment to life and gave new traction to the very first equal rights law, that is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. In that case, the Supreme Court referred to the 13th Amendment as a promise made by the nation. In its decision, the court recalled Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull's 1865 declaration that the 13th Amendment was a trumpet of freedom. Against the backdrop of laws, cases, and other actions, the court recognized the 13th Amendment as a new birth of freedom. But the Supreme Court also recognized that the 13th Amendment is not a one-time historical event whose relevance ended in 1865 or even in 1968, but is a continuing promise to keep working to eradicate the badges and incidents of slavery. Time and change over time is fundamental to understanding race in the United States. African slavery and Jim Crow prevailed for 300 years, and they have been gone literally for just over 50 years. Now, if you count a generation as 25 years, you have had 12 generations of white supremacy and now barely 2 generations trying to overcome it. Those numbers are meaningful because the passage of generations means passing on the heritage. That is 12 times of white supremacy are beginning to change it just twice. For African Americans, their descendants, laws defined and ensured a lack of freedom for many generations, even preceding creation of the United States, and continued for many generations thereafter, while also defining lack of freedom for other minority racial groups. In recent generations, law turned and worked to define and ensure the civil rights and to define freedom. As the ultimate interpreter of the law of the land, the Supreme Court has had a starring role in all of this. For generations, the court limited the meaning of freedom and even perverted language to do so. In the Dred Scott case, the court said that when the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, the words all men meant some men. And after the Civil War, the court said repeatedly that in the 14th Amendment, the word equal protection of the laws meant Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement. In the 20th century, starting in the second decade and accelerating in the second and third quarters of the century, the Supreme Court giving the word equal protections of the laws a truer meaning, and the court began paving the way and then led the way along with other institutions to dismantling Jim Crow for all races. In the last 30 years, law seems to have changed direction again. After the Supreme Court's resurrection of the 13th Amendment in 1968 and its use in 2 further important cases, the 13th Amendment has again essentially disappeared from Supreme Court decisions, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that critical piece of legislation, has been under a repeated assault. For the last decade of the 20th century and the entire 21st century to the present in 2020, the Supreme Court has rarely ruled in favor of racial minority claims. Minorities have not lost every case, as they essentially did from 1890 to 1910, and for the most part did in 1870 to 1890, but they have won precious few. A simple scorecard is hardly a basis for drawing conclusions, but is a base for closer scrutiny, for looking to see if patterns exist. When the Supreme Court struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, it created spurious doctrine to do so. The court has 3 times limited or threatened to limit the meaning of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The court has adopted new interpretations of civil rights laws that deny a remedy even where they had been discrimination. In some of these cases, the court has seriously misquoted prior cases to claim precedential support when it did not exist. Whether the court's patterns of decisions in race cases reflect a view that race problems ended when segregation was outlawed or reflect some other reason, it is almost as if the justices suffer from historical amnesia about the tight web of laws and regulations that created the color line. Often expressed in discussion of racial issues as a refrain, we've come a long way. Part of that refrain may add, but we still have a long way to go. Racial inequalities reflected across the board. African Americans and other racial minority people have less wealth and more poverty, more dead-end jobs. They have less access to health care, which leads to higher incidence of diabetes and heart conditions and higher infant mortality. COVID-19 kills inordinately more African Americans than their percentage of the population would expect. While homeownership is growing across all racial categories, neighborhoods, and therefore schools are often racially segregated, perhaps more segregated than any time in history. Many predominantly minority schools have fewer resources. Black men and women are targets of racial profiling by police and store security guards, not to mention vigilantes like we saw recently in Georgia. The school to jail pipeline puts more African American men in prison than ever before, and men of other minority races too. On the other hand, There are more African Americans and minority doctors, lawyers, congresspeople, senators, elected and appointed officials, engineers, firefighters, and building contractors and subcontractors than ever. And more African Americans grew up with parents who are doctors, lawyers, politicians, engineers, firefighters, building contractors, and subcontractors. More minorities attend and teach in previously all-white schools, including the most prestigious private university. Although this may put unfortunate pressure on historically Black colleges and universities that play such an important role in United States education. When highway travel calls for an overnight stop, African Americans no longer need to consult their green book. Gas stations, restaurants, and motels have guests of all colors, and the guests of all colors and their children share the common breakfast room and the swimming pool. Interracial couples, heterosexual or other, hardly rate a second look on the street or on television. African Americans have integrated TV shows and commercials, as have other minorities, but to a lesser degree. To be sure, inclusion of minorities on TV is not the same as inclusion in managerial careers or CEOs of corporations. A Black child swimming with white children is not the same as owning the motel. Nevertheless, these changes were unthinkable not so many years ago, and to minimize their significance is a huge mistake. Recognizing that real change has happened proves that more change can and will happen. Historical awareness provides the encouragement and incentives to keep working for change. A myth of the past was that law could not change human attitudes on behavior. The study of American history shows otherwise. Discriminatory laws were doing just that. They were changing human attitudes and behavior to the bad. Today's laws are designed to make our behavior less discriminatory. New generations reared under these newer laws and changing demographics should foster these positive changes. In today's society, it seems inconceivable that we could have anything like a repeat of the decline into Jim Crow. But a complacent failing to heed the opportunity to move forward is also damaging. We as citizens can speed the pace of progress toward equal justice, or we can retard that pace. Historian C. Van Woodward, one of my personal heroes of the history profession, and the writer of history who made me want to be a historian, described one of the dangers of complacency when he testified before the House Judiciary Committee on renewal of the voting rights in 1981. He warned that revolutions such as the first Reconstruction have and can go backwards. 6 years before Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he first announced the new birth of freedom and the unfinished work that he called Americans to do during the war, African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass said the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution together, quote, give us a platform broad enough and strong enough to support the most comprehensive plans for the freedom and elevation of all the people of this country without regard to color, class, or climate. The 13th Amendment can be the guide. Remember that it's not merely a historical event of the past, but a continuing promise to remove all the badges and instances of slavery and the oppression of 12 generations should produce the change that will benefit everyone in this country of every race and ethnic group and every gender. That is the future. The goal of overturning centuries-long patterns of racial hierarchy and institutional exclusion was monumental. Generations of rigid law and custom had created a deeply rooted caste society with signs of inequality and separation everywhere. This was universally understood at a personal level by both Blacks and even whites. The United States has always faced a conflict between ideal and reality. America's ideals of justice, equality, and liberty are for the individual rather than a group, yet the nation's institutions, led by the state and federal governments, have long violated the ideal, enslaving a group, denying opportunity to a group. This has created a present-day reality that is the very opposite of the ideal. The question for the nation is how to undo that reality. Now, reparations is a political strategy that has rarely been effective because generally the people with money are resentful of having to pay out the money. Reparations work when the people with the money feel they have to pay out. Perhaps the most successful example of reparations is the West German payment of reparations to Holocaust survivors and Israel. West Germany wanted to rejoin the civilized world. The Holocaust survivors needed the money. The problem with reparations is that white America hasn't wanted to pay out. And when you do not want to do something, you can come up with any number of excuses for not doing so. Can this change now? There are a million practical questions. That said, if approached in the spirit of making amends for slavery and post-slavery, police reform, economic reform, perhaps talk of reparations, which could go to Black communities or to African-American individuals, is perhaps no longer impossible. In the wake of victims such as George Floyd in Minneapolis, with his phone video going viral and his monuments are coming down, I never thought I would live long enough to see that they're going to take down John C. Calhoun, who is the senator who introduced the pro-slavery and the idea that slavery is a positive good into the Senate, into the nation, really. That came up and led in the gag laws to keep it out of Congress in a discussion of slavery, who is the person responsible for making people like Lincoln, who could live with slavery as long as the founding fathers said it was necessary evil, but what Calhoun says it is the best system for all the world. Then Lincoln and others had to make a decision. And now the mayor yesterday announced that the city of Charleston wants to remove Calhoun's statue, which is the highest statue in all of Charleston, and actually overlooks Mother Emanuel, which is 5 years ago. We're looking at the commemoration again of that horrible massacre by a white supremacist who was holding the Confederate flag in a picture on his Facebook flag. So there's a lot that is going on at this time. I believe we're in the midst of a real revolution. A revolution actually very similar to the civil rights movement. And when businesses and corporations during the civil rights movement decided that it was in their better interest, their business interests and for moral reasons, to no longer support segregated lunch counters or segregated department stores, when African Americans had boycotted them, we did get the change that people thought was impossible. Now, we will probably never know the names of the victims of terrorism. We had the video of George Floyd and others that I have a long list. I won't go through them here. In fact, we know the story of the call of the Kennedys to Martin Luther King when he was in jail, but you have to understand what that meant. How many people like Martin Luther King who were protesting for civil rights, for justice, for change to the law, went into jail and were never heard from again? We think that terrorism in America began in 9/11, but Americans, that is African Americans, have lived in a terroristic society since 1865, at least to 1965, and the Voting Rights Act, when they began to have some way of expressing their ideas and their discomfort and changing the laws. In fact, if you think about it, when I testified for Gary in Texas, there are people alive today who go to vote, who it was dangerous in their lifetime to go to that very place to register. Think about all the Confederate monuments that stand at courthouse squares in front of the courthouse. While that might symbolize to a number of white people, ancestors who fought for the Confederacy, even died, it also symbolized to African Americans they will not find justice in that courthouse. It's a great time to be a historian of the United States, especially American South. And at this moment, as we live through this revolution, I think it's important to remember that good revolutions like this one are both exhilarating and a time for wariness. But what was impossible before or even now might actually become possible. We saw the end of segregation, the Confederate flags, the monuments being moved. I think the future's upon us, but it must be one that we can choose and see ourselves in. This requires a personal, local, national, and global effort. Maybe then reconciliation will be possible. But let us deal with the truth and repair our country and look at its history honestly first. We never had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, an opportunity as South Africa did when we ended segregation and legal apartheid. We have, of course, great examples of what can be done there, not only in South Africa, but look what Baltimore and New Orleans under Mayor Landau did about bringing people together to discuss the pros and cons of removing monuments and the dialogue. It is such a teachable moment. I think it's difficult for students today to even fathom the depth of the apartheid system or the degree of contempt for the courts, the law in the mid-20th century in the U.S. South after the 1954 Brown v. Board school desegregation decision. Now is the time, and now might also be the time for reparations. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission rooted in repair, focused on reparations, that holds hearings around the country to tell the true history of this country, not the untruths we've been told in history books, but the theft of indigenous peoples' lands, of the violent horrors, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement, the violent overthrow of the interracial, democratically elected, progressive local and state governments in the Reconstruction American South. There were real coup d'etats here in the United States, and nothing was done about it. Denial of opportunities in every aspect of American life: police violence, mass incarceration, resource poor school, health disparities, unaffordable housing, etc. Now, the Bible tells us that when the Hebrew slaves were freed, the Egyptian gave them gold, silver, and fine garments. No such reception greeted America's freed slaves. No 40 acres, no mules. Instead, for generations, every effort was made to keep them shackled to white people's lands and out of white people's businesses. Finally, in the 1950s and finally in the 1960s, after more than 300 years, when the good jobs, land, housing, school, business opportunities, not least of all, money went to white people, the United States made a commitment of sorts to a national policy of freedom and racial equality. And there is historical precedent actually for reparations. Lincoln had been willing to compensate white slave owners to convince them to free their slaves. He tried to get the 4 Union states that still had slavery to free their slaves for compensation. Under Lincoln, giving land to freed people occurred. Lincoln supported Sherman's order that gave land to African Americans. The 1866 Freedmen's Bureau bill that Andrew Johnson vetoed, in fact, provided for land for freedmen. And most congressmen assumed that the 1866 Southern Homestead Act would provide a way for freedmen to get land and have the first opportunity. In 1915, Memphis attorney, African-American Cornelius J. Jones, brought a class action suit against the Secretary of the Treasury, William G. McAdoo, in the local courts of Washington, D.C., and he asked for $68 million. He claimed that the U.S. had wrongfully benefited from a tax on raw cotton, and that this money should be used to compensate the African Americans who had picked cotton from just 1859 to 1868, and their ancestors who had been subject to a system of involuntary servitude. That's a quote from the lawsuit. Now, the DC court rejected on procedural grounds. They said that McAdoo was just a custodian of the treasury. The real defendants were the United States itself, and the United States cannot be party to a lawsuit without consent, and the U.S. court upheld that. And of course, immediately after that, the United States brought an indictment against Jones for fraud when he asked for contribution of $1.75 from people to pursue the reparations. You also have the example of the Japanese internment. On Sunday, December 17, 1944, the government formally announced that it would begin emptying the internment camps 2 weeks later. On January 2nd, 1945, all the internees and people who had been interned were released with $25 and a train ticket home. Now, freedmen did not even get $25 or a train ticket. 40 years later, the United States delivered some gestures of amends. The Civil Liberty Acts of 1988 provided reparations of $20,000 each to some 80,000 camp internees who were still alive. In 1984 and 1987, Gordon Hibashi and Fred Komatsu were exonerated when federal courts reversed their wartime convictions and all charges were dismissed. Now, I think there's some creative ideas that we can use. That is, when we say to people, we could subsidize home ownership. We can learn from the mistakes of the past of trying to help people from the last recession we went into. When you think about the investments and the equity that comes out of housing, people forget that even Social Security that came during the New Deal, Southern white legislators were able to get farm workers and domestics exempted so that most blacks in the rural South were not getting Social Security. You had the racial covenants and the redlining that kept people from buying homes. With the GI Bill, African Americans couldn't attend a integrated school in Texas or any other Southern state. You had redlining and those racial covenants that if they did use the GI Bill to buy a home, they could not buy a home where equity increased. Therefore, they end up in Ward 9 in New Orleans, where the flood occurred, because they have to go to places that others don't want. You can go on and on and on, but this is just one of ways I think you can be creative in arguing how reparations could be used and go to individuals as well as to communities. Well, in conclusion, my wife tells me to always say that to give some hope to the audience. Let's not forget that revolutions do go backwards, and the story of a successful implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and then their undoing stands as a warning for today's voters and for court interpretation. Nevertheless, let us end on a positive note with one certainty. The Constitution of the United States, with the Civil War's amendments, guiding principle of citizenship and equality, is still a foundation of a new birth of freedom. If you bear with me, I'd like to, in fact, just use the last sentence of the book, The Age of Lincoln, that I wrote, where we say that determine that the thing can and shall be done, wrote Lincoln, and then we shall find the way. Thank you very, very much.
Dr. Burton, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really tremendous. I think that we'll have some questions later, and I think individuals who might have questions might send them in the chat. I think Mr. Davis might be going over those later on. Let me introduce my co-moderator, who's going to introduce our second outstanding panelist, but that was indeed a wealth of information and some tremendous thoughts and ideas, both for Congressman Jackson Lee and Congressman Green, in reference to the important legislation that they both have now pending in the United States Congress in reference to addressing issues that are still pending being addressed, according to Dr. Burton. Cedric Davis is a second-year law student at the Thurgood Marshall School of Law, and he has a Master of Public Affairs from the Jordan Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. And recently he shared a paper with me that he'd done in reference to a survey that he'd done in reference to racial attitudes, in reference to funding of police, that I sent to Dr. Henderson, who's head of the Justice Research Center. And he was ecstatic about the work that Cedric had done and wanted to obviously put his research to good use. So that shows the talent of this great young law student. But I wanted him to introduce our second presenter, Dr. Odusola. And so with that, let's welcome a good young man that we're looking forward to seeing great things from in the future, Cedric Davis. Cedric, go ahead, please introduce Dr. Odusola.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Dr. Bledsoe. And I want to thank all of the panelists for welcoming me to share this panel with you. It's an honor to share it with you all. And next, I want to introduce Dr. Ayodele Odusola. He is a resident representative for the United Nations Development Program in South Africa. Prior, he was the chief economist and head of the strategy analysis team for UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa. He provides strategic leadership on development strategy, policy analysis, and knowledge of products on Africa. Further, he coordinates the preparation of regional flagship reports for RBA, including the Africa Human Development Report, the African Economic Outlook, Africa, MGD, SDGs report in the book Income, Inequality Trends in Sub-Saharan Africa, Divergence, Determinants, and Consequences, which he co-edited, as well as strategic policy notes and occasional policy papers. Dr. Olasola provides intellectual leadership to SDG, acceleration frameworks in sub-Saharan Africa, managing the network of senior economists in UNDP's Africa country offices and providing strategic advice on policy matters to the RBA director. He provides technical leadership on roundtables to mobilize partnerships and finance for the implementation of national development plans and visions across African countries. He is deeply involved in advising African countries' development planning and visioning structural economic transformation in the future of Africa's development. I want to welcome Dr. Olasola.
Thank you very much, moderator. And let me just use this opportunity to really thank the co-conveners, Dr. Bledsoe and Dr. Anthony Rodriguez, the co-presenter, and Dr. Venom Burton and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure and honor to be here today to really commemorate the Emancipation Day, Juneteenth. I just want to really re-echo the fact that this is something that is considered to be very critical in development issues, and particularly the commemoration of today's event is happening at the margin of so many things happening around the world. It is very clear that we all know, we are aware about the global pandemic of COVID-19, which has caged almost every part of the world to really do away with what we're used to, because COVID-19 has really shattered the fundamentals of our societies, changing the way we do things, changing the way we govern, and changing the way we behave. And just at the margin of this, what really happened in terms of the Black movement, the Black Lives Matter, is something that has really galvanized action across the world, cutting across government, cutting across business community, cutting across civil society organizations and international organizations. And we thought it is something that is really at the heart of social cohesion, of national and global development, peace and stability. And in response to inequality and brutal killing, as well as discrimination and injustice to a lot of vulnerable groups and vulnerable people, not only in America, but also across the parts of the world, and has generated a lot of popular movement with critical mass for change, with strong support across many demographics and professions, including members of the global political and economic classes. And on the basis of this, it gives me the privilege to really re-echo the words of the founding fathers of the United Nations system, that clearly showed that it is very important for us to respect humanity and dignity, and that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and right. Today's leaders, slavery, racism, discrimination in all their forms are weapons of oppression that must not be allowed to exist. The United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Anthony Guterres, message on the International Day of the Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Trade, observed on the 25th of March this year, whose theme is Confronting Slavery's Legacy of Racism Together, says, slavery is one of the biggest crimes in the history of mankind. And racism is a reason why outside Africa, people of African descent are often among the last in the line for healthcare, for education, for justice, and for opportunities of all kinds. And Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, which stipulates that United Nations promotes and encourages respect for human rights and for fundamental freedom for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, and religion. Indeed, the foundation of the United Nations is the conviction that all human beings are equal and entitled to life and live without fear of persecution. Today, many people are facing dehumanizing injustice, as was experienced by George Floyd and others whose lives were unjustifiably and wickedly taken away in recent past, which has led to the global protest against racism and injustice across the world. The main message from this worldwide protest and solidarity movement is that we must all move to dismantle racist institutions all over the world by upholding high respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction to any race, sex, language, or religion. With strong support from civil rights movement in the United States, the United Nations in 1969 brought to bear the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The Sustainable Development Goals, which was endorsed by the world leaders in September 2015, aimed to end not only poverty and inequality by 2030, but also to end exclusion and human rights violation in all its forms. In our own little way, we have tried as much as possible to really see how we can leverage the spirit of solidarity. Because it is clear that individualism may not be able to really take us to the promised land. There is need for us to work in groups. There's need for us to work in solidarity, for us to really make sure the issue of humanity, the issue of human rights violation is really addressed. And on this, the United Nations Development Program was given the role by the United Nations General Assembly to be the integrator of development agenda across countries. And one of these roles is convening stakeholders on matters that are critical to development. And one of the things we are talking about right now is the Black Lives Matter movement. And on the basis of this, there is need for us to really convey actors across the globe, actors across the government, across the business community, across the civil society organizations, and across international organizations, for us to really be able to talk on the issues Dr. Burton really mentioned earlier on. How can we really look at issues that really matter to us in a way that we can use this as the convening ground for us to address common issues of interest that is really facing the society as recently experienced in the United States. Again, in line with this, the Sustainable Development Agenda for 2030 that the world leaders, all the countries of the world signed to, built on 5 principles of people, of prosperity for all, of respecting the planet so that we can all benefit about environmental service that is meant for human beings, promoting peace and stability, and at the same time, establishing partnership for mutual coexistence in our societies. This is built on 7 development goals: cutting across poverty, food security, health, access to basic health, access to education, issues of water and sanitation, issues of energy, issues of growth, job for everyone, issues of addressing inequality, issues relating to the environment, issues relating to better governance. The issue of Black Lives Matter we're all talking about is about governance issue. Because without it, we won't be able to live together as an entity that is supposed to be called a family, irrespective of where we belong, irrespective of our religion, irrespective of our color, irrespective of our race, irrespective of where we come from. This is one thing that should bring us together as humanity. And that is one of the things that the United Nations really preaches every day, to make sure that human dignity is well respected, human rights violation is put to an end, and at the same time, any form of discrimination and injustice to human beings is completely stopped. And I think the organization of this event today is really very apt, and is very relevant to what is happening not only in the United States, but across the world. On this, on the need for us to really make sure this is really achieved, underscore the need for collective spirit that opens door for the advancement of individuals combined with solidarity efforts, so that we'll be able to address the issues that is facing all of us. And in this regard, I just want to really re-echo the fact that before last month, many households and even the private sector, companies and business organizations were silent on issues of racial inequality. Today, many of them are now aligned, if not most, aligned to the issue for us to really address racial equality. And on the basis of this, many of them have even made a lot of pledges in terms of making sure we end racism across the world, we end injustice across the world, we end discrimination across the world. And it is on this issue of promoting equity, on the issue of promoting prosperity among all, irrespective of race, that brought the United Nations Development Program, Regional Bureau for Africa, with the core planning group of the historically Black colleges and universities in the United States just last year, to really come together how we can bridge this bridge. How can we really make sure we bring to an end the kind of injustice that pervades in our societies? And that is what led to the event we organized on quality education in September 2019. And we strongly believe this is one of the actions we can do in terms of convening, and at the same time bringing the issues of discrimination, bringing the issues of injustice to the discussion table, and advocate on how to really make sure these issues are permanently eradicated. The partnership allows for unique opportunities to build bridges and strengthen bonds between Africans, the African Americans, and the African descent, not only towards advancing education, which was the theme that I mentioned earlier on, but to move towards the issue of social cohesion, wherever we are, whether we're in Asia, whether we're in the United States, whether we're in Europe, whether we're in Africa, the idea of being together, because the bond of solidarity brings all of us together, and the issue of brotherhood, the issue of making sure that we are our brothers and sisters keepers becomes critical in this particular moment we find ourselves. And on the basis of this, I strongly believe that we need to really see how we leverage the opportunities we have. And that's why I'm so happy about the event being organized today. The United Nations worked with world leaders in 1994 to end racism and apartheid in South Africa. We were able to do this with the help of many parts of the world. And what led to this was the kind of thing we are currently experiencing now. And that the formation of what they call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by President Nelson Mandela in South Africa in 1994, headed by Bishop Desmond Tutu, created an opportunity for such things to be addressed. And we strongly believe that we can do the same wherever racism is practiced today. The formation of the Truth Commission, the Reconciliation and Truth Commission, looked at three fundamental issues: to look at human rights violation, to suggest possible reparation and rehabilitation, and which again tallies with what Dr. Bolton just mentioned, and to seek amnesty for violators. Within the current reality on the ground in the states, reforming necessary laws and institutions will be vital in moving ahead. And that is why I think the gathering of various stakeholders today to discuss on the issue of Emancipation Day becomes critical on how to discuss on what needs to be reformed and how do we go about it. And let me conclude with the words of President Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, who says, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. And as captured by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Respect to human rights within the realm of the United Nations system is something that needs to be respected, to be upheld, to be upheld any day, any time. The fundamental freedom for all, without any distinction, is a fundamental for peaceful coexistence, social cohesion, and political stability anywhere in the world. Educating people around us and creating awareness and advocacy on the urgent needs to eliminate racism, discrimination, and injustice remains critical for all of us. Let us play our role, whether in government, business, academic institutions, civil society organizations, international organizations, in our households, and even at individual levels. This is where this principle of solidarity matters in addressing racial discrimination, injustice, and violation of human rights. Thank you.
Dr. Odusola, thank you very much. That was really tremendous and so informative and so relevant. My gosh, you pulled the right things together for this conversation. I think that really helps advance the ball in so many ways and is useful not only here in the United States, but it's really useful around the world. I have questions for each one of you, and I think Mr. Davis will probably have questions as well. But I'd like to, Dr. Burton, I think the question I wanted to have for you that I would like for you to discuss would be, you made the comment during your presentation in reference to the 13th Amendment and the badges and incidents of slavery from the Mayer case, and talked about the meaning of it. But it seems to me that that's almost become a dead provision. It hasn't really been utilized. I'd like for you to talk about that, if that's part of the research that you and Mr. Durfner are doing, and tell us, what do you think in terms of the 13th Amendment, since the court said it's meant to be live, it wasn't meant to only do one thing, and back in 1865, that it's meant to do more than that. What protections do you think were intended by the provision or the term badges and incidents of slavery from the 13th Amendment?
There's no question, Gary. I think it covered everything that would be considered a badge or incident of slavery, which would be discrimination and all of these things. And I think what happened is people began to use the 14th Amendment. I think that a lot of folks believe that with the 13th Amendment, nothing else was needed. But then the reaction that you had with the terrorism, the paramilitary groups, the attempts to re-enslave people. I have documented. I just did a disfranchisement case, not disfranchise, excuse me, a felony disfranchisement case in North Carolina for some civil rights lawyers. And I found again and again when the 13th Amendment is announced, and it has the little part that people didn't pay attention to about the Northwest Ordinance that you can accept for crime, that you cannot be enslaved, that Southern leaders announced, oh, we can still use it. North Carolina had a provision if you had been whipped for a punishment, you couldn't vote. So they made it a point to go out and whip black men, voters, so they couldn't be able to vote later, and using that 13th Amendment. But it was never intended that way, I'm convinced. And people said so. They were pushing and thought that that would be literally the end of it, that blacks would have the vote and move forward. But when under Andrew Johnson, things went differently. You might remember that Abraham Lincoln was pushing for black votes, and that's why he was killed, not for the Emancipation Proclamation, but when he does that impromptu speech, particularly after Lee's surrender, he gets up and he says that he's calling for all blacks who fought in the Civil War to vote, and for others. Then he says he's going to have some announcements to make. And that's when John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, turns to his friend and says, that'll be the last speech he ever makes. He means by that, and he used the N-word, citizenship. And indeed he did, and it was the last speech he made. Then you get Johnson in as president. Lincoln's cabinet was evenly divided on whether blacks should be able to vote for the provisional governments. That would have been black voting. Lincoln had privately advocated for that with Louisiana, saying that it would be African Americans who would protect the jewel of liberty. The cabinet was divided, but Johnson didn't even give the cabinet a chance to work it out. He literally provided the first one that becomes the example under Johnson is North Carolina, and it says they put in a grandfather clause. If you could not vote, before 1861, then you should not be able to vote afterwards. In other words, excluding people who'd been enslaved. So. And it was Chief Justice Chase, who Lincoln appointed to be the Chief Justice, had ruled on a case himself about the badges of slavery, where people had apprenticed black children against their parents' wishes to keep them as slaves. And he used that as an example of the badges of slavery. In several other cases. So they meant explicitly that things that would be a badge of slavery. That's why I tied into reparations. It seems to me a badge of slavery is in fact exactly what's happened with housing in the United States, with redlining in the districts and things like that, the covenants that have allowed the equity to grow for whites and white citizens, and particularly whites who were able to use the GI Bill, but not for African Americans. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
I make the argument. Well, Armin and I make this argument explicitly. I think it's a novel argument. I think it's unique that it has not at all died. It just hasn't been used. People turn to the 14th Amendment, and as you know, that's really been under attack. But the 13th Amendment, with the 1866 Civil Rights Act, are the critical ones, I believe, that can still be used and need to be used.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. My good friend Victor Good, who is going to be on the next panel, has always talked about that. I think that one should look at new litigation in that realm. I do know courts have typically thrown many cases out under the 13th Amendment because they either don't understand it or have a disdain for it. But I think that's correct. And it seems to me one comment that you just made, I think, would be worthwhile, because this is a big issue in this country today. And that is in reference to the laws that limit your ability to vote. And it's always been, it seems clear to me, but I want to hear it from you because you're the expert, that many of the laws that brought in criminal backgrounds as being disabling in terms of your ability to vote were brought in reference to the emancipation of slaves to make sure that freed slaves could not have the political impact that they could throughout the South. But that may be a misunderstanding on my part. What's the actual truth about that, Dr. Burton?
Well, I think you're exactly right, and all of these restrictions that are put up for voting, you have voting expanding until African Americans get the vote, and you have it, of course, expanded during Reconstruction when you have the former Confederate states under military occupation, what's called Congressional Reconstruction, when they completely refused to support. Congress does these sort of backward-looking, very racist, anti-black, and supporting the former planter class that Andrew Johnson does. Congress takes over Reconstruction and implements Congressional Reconstruction. So you have a brief period of that time of when you have the expanding franchise, open franchise, so there's still terrorist groups and things. You have the anti-Ku Klux Klan acts. All of these things to protect blacks that are needed because white terrorists keep fighting these things. And initially, Grant, pretty well destroys the Klan when he sends in the U.S. Army into North Carolina and South Carolina, and he really wipes it out for a while in South Carolina. But as I think the nation, you have there's a lot, you don't want to lecture on Reconstruction, Gary, but the economic, as we now are seeing today, the kind of hard economic times made the North less willing to support black rights in the South. But initially, they were very, very determined to make sure that this Civil War, where so many people died, and that war became from a war which was to preserve the Union, which is what Lincoln defined it as. He then, with the Emancipation Proclamation, defined it also as a war to end slavery, and then his new birth of freedom and his jewel of liberty, as he called it. Okay. Now, and I would argue the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment redefined liberty from the United States. Before that, the first 10 amendments had all been to give the states a right, we the people. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments explicitly give Congress the power to do things and keep the states and people from doing things. And that is really aimed at keeping African Americans from voting.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I do know that I've seen the courts now sua sponte on their own drop 15th Amendment claims. They seem to do what you're saying. They want to deal with the 14th Amendment and only the 14th Amendment. That's become a real problem.
And Gary, I do think what we as experts and attorneys have to do is explain to them why the 13th Amendment is still alive and active and has not had the rulings against us that the 14th and they're trying to do with the Civil Rights Act, the immunities and protections clauses.
Doc, we should do a conference just on the 13th Amendment and really.
I think so too.
Look towards the view. Dr. Odusola, you mentioned, and I thought this is rightfully so. I know that we talked about HR 992 from Congressman Green to create a cabinet level position, a Department of Reconciliation in the United States. And I know we've heard Dr. Burton talk about how there's been such a reluctance from whites in this country to pay reparations to persons of African descent who were descendants of slaves in this country. And I know that Congressman Green's bill, similar to Congressman Jackson Lee's bill on reparations, is intended to go after that and address that. And you talked about one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was required to do was to look at claims of potential reparations and make determinations as to whether individuals would be entitled to reparations. Do you know what the standards that were used in terms of what they used to segregate individuals in South Africa who might be entitled to reparations from the country? And do you know whether or not, after the resolution of that commission, if any individuals actually receive reparations?
Well, thank you very much. The beauty of it is that most of the members of the commission, they're still alive, and there are a number of things which we can really organize together to really see how this one is really achieved. The three elements they mentioned, the first with respect to the issue of violation of human rights, documenting it so that it is clear and it's really evident in terms of what has been done. I think that's one of the elements, and particularly the one you mentioned is about the issue of reparation. And in fact, in South Africa, they added issue of rehabilitation as part of it. I know it may be difficult to quantify what reparation is. It varies from context to context. And the situation under apartheid might not be the same. Where currently what we have in terms of the Black Americans, the African Americans as we have today, because there was a total segregation under the apartheid regime, where the blacks were moved into the homeland, go to different settlement completely outside the current towns that we know, Johannesburg, Pretoria, and a few other ones, including Cape Town. Now, but what is really critical is that there are so many forms of indicators of measurement and standards of measuring what should be the cost and the quantification of reparation, depending on what has really happened. And I think this could be one of the issues we could organize in terms of really bringing the key actors together in terms of what can we really do in terms of the issue of reparation. I know there has been a long movement on the issue of reparation across many African countries, many Caribbean countries, in terms of what should be done. But I think what we need to do is looking at those countries that have done it more resourcefully, more efficiently, and again, link them up with colleagues wherever they are, whether in the States or in some other parts of the world, and then see how we can organize some kind of dialogue, and even if it's possible, to have some kind of exchange in terms of making things on the ground more practical and more result-oriented. This is something that I think we can do, because there are so many things we discuss here in South Africa relating to truth and reconciliation, which is still on. The commission is still on, and regularly they try to identify where the gaps are and then try to bridge the gap. And they devote substantial resources. The government at the national level devotes substantial resources to meeting the needs of the commission. It did not die immediately after the report was prepared. No, it really led to a long-standing commission that continues on a regular basis to identify where the gaps are and then try to bridge the gap. And that's the kind of thing, for instance, one of the things they are focusing attention on is the issue of quality education. How do we ensure that those that were originally disenfranchised in terms of having access to quality education now have access to quality education? Because one of the things that this has created is high level of inequality, and that efforts to really make sure they bridge the issue of exclusion, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, is what they're really dealing with now. So I think one of the next steps could be for us to really organize another meeting where we bring different actors together and talk about how do we really use the practical instrument, measures, and standards that we can use to really push for the issue of reparation and rehabilitation.
Now, Doctor, you mentioned one thing that truly caught my ear, and for the young, great researchers like Mr. Davis here, I'm going to wonder, and I don't want to put you on the spot on this one, but you talked about there are some countries that might present great examples that have handled this issue well, of reconciliation or what have you, and that we might look with them and try to talk with them and use what they did as a guide for what we might do in other parts of the world. Are there any in particular that that you might recall as you sit here now, and what can you tell us about any that you might recall?
I know it's similar. In addition to what really happened in South Africa, a few other countries have really been able to put something like that. For instance, in South Sudan, issues like that is being discussed in terms of moving it forward. In Timor-Leste, in Asia, a similar thing was done. And these are the countries that have gone through thick and thins in terms of real segregation, in terms of discrimination, and they thought there is need for them to really come together and address the issue headlong, because there's no way you can continue to run away from the issue unless you face it headlong and collectively agree on what needed to be done. So these are the countries that have been able to do something in terms of moving the initiative forward through truth and reconciliation. And there are a few other countries that went through serious war in the past. I don't know whether you've heard about the very powerful result-oriented truth and reconciliation in Rwanda. That's incidentally, it almost tallied with the same period that we're talking about apartheid in the 90s. That is where they set up a Truth and Reconciliation Committee together, and up till now they are still implementing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that was set up to address the fundamental issues behind genocide in Rwanda. And this is something that I think is, if you're looking for result-oriented solutions, it's really one of the very few countries who can get such brilliant solutions that are well implemented, because the implementation is still going on as we speak in Rwanda on the outcome of the truth and reconciliation.
Okay. That's really great information. I can see Mr. Davis nodding there, so I think he's probably got a question for one or both of you. Cedric? Did you have a question? I thought your eyes told me that you had a question.
I'm experiencing technical difficulties right now. Can you hear me?
Oh, sure, we can. Well, I'll go on to a couple more questions then, and we'll wait for you to get those issues resolved. So, Dr. Bird, I'd like to go back to you and ask you in reference to, we just heard Dr. Odusola talk, and I know you had mentioned what occurred in reference to Germany and the internment of Jews in concentration camps in that country, the horrible situation there, and even reparations being made to Israel, where I think individuals were repatriated, and that was one example. So I'd love to hear from you in terms of the best examples. We have young people putting together information for Congresswoman Jackson Lee or Congressman Green. Where would you direct them to go, and what resources would you say would actually have great databases and show us good examples of what could be done? And one of the things I want to ask both of you is, we talked about the white resistance in this country, and I'd love to know what Dr. Odusola thinks, and you too, Dr. Bird, in reference to what about the rest of the world. You know, what about the Afrikaans in South Africa? Or I know the resistance in Zimbabwe to Mugabe and some of the reforms that Mugabe wanted to bring about. So are we saying that whites in this country are different, or that's better in other countries because the numbers of African Americans or persons of African descent are greater? Or what's the difference that makes it where you can do these kinds of things in some countries but not in others?
I do think that having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission really helps. And I'm not trying in any way to defend or justify how people feel, but part of what I wanted to say in all of this, Gary, was that those 12 generations, though Lincoln and the Union won the Civil War, white Southerners and white Southern sympathizers wrote the history. And that history has been taught, and it has continued to be taught. Now, almost all college professors, I think, will agree with me in my interpretation. And it's been this way pretty much since the 1980s, for instance, on Reconstruction and slavery. But they were still using the textbook I had used in 96, South Carolina, where I grew up, in the 1980s, which made slavery sound that it was not a very difficult situation, that whites were doing blacks favors, that Reconstruction was a horrible thing. It's instead of the most progressive period that South Carolina's probably ever experienced. or this was South Carolina state history. When Brown v. Board came into effect, people heard about Mississippi mandated that Mississippi teach state history in the 8th and I believe 12th grades. It was that way anyway in South Carolina. And the reason given was to preserve our way of life, which was white supremacy, and that was taught and continued taught. I give a lot of to-dos and praise to public high school teachers who are really the first generation that have come up under the revisionist interpretation that shows just how this Old South lost cause mythology was created and taught, and to look at and understand how much of that was, in the words of certain people today, alternative interpretation, alternative facts based upon it. So we have to thank, I think, the great group of young teachers who've come of age, have come through college, and are now getting this history and understanding that is education. Lincoln believed that you had to have education to have democracy. And I think so much of that is true. And education is more than going to school. He himself had less than 1 year of formal education, but he learned and changed his mind when he learned from people like Robert Smalls, the congressman from South Carolina, who had stolen the planter and sailed it out of Charleston Harbor, and then had fought with the Union. And when he met with Lincoln for over an hour, Lincoln asked him, why would you risk your life, your wife and child, your men's life? Because you would have been terrible things happened to you if the Confederacy had caught you. It was very dangerous. And he gave him a one-word answer, and that was freedom. And that's exactly what Lincoln then echoed later in his new birth of freedom. And that's that we need to be able to change and grow. I think we really need to have dialogue. I'm not trying to excuse it, but I do think that people believe so much of this nonsense. What I don't forgive very easily are those politicians who know better, but are using race to motivate voters, who are, in fact, to vote against their own economic interest. And I think they know better. They've been educated and they know much better than the kind of rhetoric they're using, the kind of things they're saying. But I think a lot of people, have how many generations been sold on this idea of the Old South mythology of enlightenment, of the pro-slavery argument has basically been written into the textbooks, let alone how Reconstruction has been used. When I first started, in fact, testifying as expert witness in voting rights cases, it was not unusual to find legislatures and others harking back to the horrors of Reconstruction when you have an interracial democracy, saying you can't let this happen again. When in fact, it's a very different story if you look at the record.
Dr. Braden, thanks so much. That's a tremendously insightful response. Dr. Otasola, we'd like you to maybe finalize the last comment here in reference to what you've seen in reference to that issue, how whites around the world have responded, and if there is anything we can learn, a guide you can give us in regards to that when we go forward with this issue.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you. Okay, could you hear me?
Yes, sorry. No, I didn't hear you very well. Could you repeat your question, please?
Okay. There has been resistance. We were talking about resistance in this country and what it might take to overcome resistance and to move forward. Dr. Burton mentioned dialogue or what have you. And I know I alluded to what occurred in Zimbabwe and of course, you talked a good bit about South Africa and other places. And so in terms of getting larger buy-in and all that, just wanted to get what advice you would give those who are seeking to advance such issues in this country in terms of what kinds of things that, as of now, we might know that might potentially benefit successful efforts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the starting point is what Dr. Burton really mentioned. Dialogue is it. In the United Nations system, there is hardly any other solution other than dialogue. That's the starting point. Because the idea of silence is that it does not lead to any solution. It's good for people to vocalize their feelings and at the same time create opportunity for us to be dialoguing on a regular basis. And I think the issues that has the movement that has been started because of what really happened to George, it's really something that needs to be really catalyzed into more actions. The idea is for us to not only gather within ourselves, let's cross the bridge, let's bring people of different ideas, different background, different contexts together. The beauty of it is that if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it cut across demographic, it cut across races, it cut across religion, and that is the beauty of it. And that is the platform we can use to really engage our political leaders, to engage institutions, including the police, to engage the people that are really, really affected. And I think this is one thing which we need to really do in terms of making sure that we create opportunities for dialogue and discussions. We need to do this. We shouldn't allow it just go that way. And the messages that are coming on is that you see even the business communities now coming to say, oh, this is where with you. And why don't we leverage the opportunity to really make sure we use it to right the wrong? Why don't we use the opportunity that the various actors are coming on board to really mobilize action for us to effect change? Things have started at some states, at some state level, even in some counties, in terms of changing what the extant laws that are really promoting and perpetrating or propagating inequality and injustice. So what we need to do is for us to continue to gather together, write position papers, engage our political leaders, engage our councillors, engage our House of Rep members, engage our governors and mayors, and really make sure this is what is needed. I think we need to catalyze and make effective use of this particular movement that is helping us to really drown and dive quite deep into issues that are affecting the society. Dialogue is number one, dialogue is number two, dialogue is number three. So I think that's the way, and that's the major principle and the tool that the United Nations uses to really engage in terms of issues that affect people, in terms of issues that affect races and discrimination, in terms of people, in terms of issues that we need to really push down for us to get a solution for. And I think there is no end to it in terms of creating platform. We need to really see how we leverage all the relevant institutions, even within the academic institutions, bring them together. Let's create awareness. Let's raise advocacy, and let's send position papers to relevant authorities for change.
Lovely.
Thank you both so much. That was tremendous information. I think what we should do is make sure we try to coordinate efforts. You mentioned about the value of research and all that. We've got so many great researchers and great faculty members that are involved in many countries and nations. Let's make this a cohesive effort. That adds to the discussion for later on. So thank you both. And so I guess you both could hold on now. I think we have a welcome coming.
Well, what's going to happen?
Let me turn over to Dr. Rodriguez and let him tell us what we have.
What's going to happen? We have Congressman Al Green.
Right?
He's trying to get his camera on right now. So just give me a moment. Let me help him get his camera on. One moment, please.
Okay, well, let me just say, give a warm welcome to, or thank you to both of our guests, because I think they were tremendous and provided a roadmap for where we can go.
Yes, I'm seeing him. He's his camera right now. We'll pick a video.
Doc, you have a live mic again.
And he's coming right after the president. Now I'm seeing him right now. He just needs to turn on his camera. Okay? No, he can unmute. It's fine. He's fine. Just he can go ahead. His phone is his audio is on right now. He just needs to turn on his camera. Right after the president stops, he will begin speaking. Okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Congressman.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I
It's
want
like that. Happy Juneteenth. We're getting some distortion. Richard, what's the technology? It was.
Dr. President Hewitt.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We're back. I can't hear anything, but I can see you. Still don't have any sound.
I think Dr. Rodriguez is attempting to play a video right now.
No, we're going to bypass the video. We just give it over to Al Green. Apparently, the president's video is refusing to come on directly. So, Professor Bledsoe, why not bring in Al Green and we'll move on? Turn on your mic, Professor Bledsoe.
Congressman, thank you so much. We know that your time is valuable, and there's a lot of things going on in the United States Congress today, and you've taken your time out to come and speak to the great folks here. I don't know if you heard those two great speakers there, but I think they both have a wealth of information that will be very supportive for you in your efforts to get H.R. 992 passed. But Dr. Orville Vernon Burton, you might remember as a great redistricting expert, and even testified in front of you guys to renew the Civil Rights Act back in '06. And Dr. Ayodele Adesola from the United Nations Department of Programs, who is has great wealth of knowledge about what's occurring around the world, and particularly about the Reconciliation and Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that you're wanting to create in this country. So thank you for what you're doing. We applaud your efforts. We know that you're looking out to make this a better nation and the best nation that it can be. I don't want to take your time up because that's valuable. I just wanted to make sure that folks understood that the 9th Congressional Representative in the state of Texas is here with us, and we're proud of him, and we want to hear about H.R. 992, Emancipation Day, and all that from him, and what we might be able to do to help him. But please enlighten us, Congressman. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, and happy Juneteenth to all of you. It's an honor to be a part of such an august body. I did have an opportunity to hear some of what was said, and I must commend you. The experts have been absolutely outstanding. I want to thank Mr. Bledsoe personally for not only this effort, but for his many efforts. As the president of the state NAACP, he has done an outstanding job, but what some may not know is that he has been the acting dean over at the Thurgood Marshall School of Law during a time of some degree of difficulty, I might add. And he performed with a superior degree of intellect and brought a good deal of value to the process that we were trying to negotiate our way through, saying it in a nebulous way so as not to get into any aspects of what was going on. Doctors and friends all, I think we are currently experiencing an Edmund Pettus Bridge moment. If you'll recall, in 1965, the marchers assembled at Brown Chapel AME Church. They were determined to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And at that time, Dr. King was not with them. The Honorable John Lewis, of course, was there, and he was one of the leaders of the march. In their efforts to march from Selma to Montgomery, and this was to secure voting rights, they had to cross the bridge. The Edmund Pettus Bridge is something that every person ought to see because it has a crest. And as you march up the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and when you reach the crest, then you can see things over on the other side that you ordinarily would not be able to see. So these marchers, as they moved toward the bridge and they reached the crest, they saw on the other side persons with clubs. They were parts of the constabulary, if you will, members of the police force, the law enforcement, and they were there to stop the marchers. And the marchers could easily have, at that time, simply
Can you hear me again now, please? Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
I can.
I don't know where you lost me, but I was talking about the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the marchers confronting the constabulary, and they could have turned away. So I admire the courage of the marchers. They confronted the constabulary, and they were beaten all the way back to the church. The Honorable John Lewis indicates that he thought he was going to die. This became known as Bloody Sunday. It was seen around the world. And not only did the world conclude that this was inappropriate behavior, and that's putting it kindly, but fortunately for us, we were part of that world, and the people in this country concluded that there had to be some change. This was the means by which, to a certain extent, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was secured because of Bloody Sunday. It enabled us to spawn a good many other aspects of the society that we enjoy now, and some of these things we take for granted. Not going to go into all of them. But I said that this is an Edmund Pettus Bridge moment because with 8 minutes and 46 seconds of having his neck kneed upon by a police officer, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, those moments in time have become a movement in time. And this movement is really centered around the concept of Black Lives Matter. Black lives truly do matter, and we truly have an opportunity now to do some things to make some significant change because of this Edmund Pettus Bridge moment. I would say to you, my dear friends, that we need the moment to become the movement, but then the movement, I think, will have to metamorphose into something more, and that is a department. The movement to a department. We do need a means by which we can maintain and sustain the movement over the years. This reconciliation is not something that happens overnight, obviously, intuitively obvious to the most casual observer, I would contend, but it is something that will be ongoing. In South Africa, we heard just today an indication that the commission is still there. The movement continues. The movement in Germany is still ongoing, and just last year there was some concessions made that will allow some of the persons who are heirs to persons who were a part of the Nazi regime's terrible tyrannical behavior, allow them to receive some compensation. And if you'll note, in Germany, there are no statues to Hitler. If we have reconciliation in this country, a part of it would, of course, be to remove the vestiges of invidious discrimination, the harmful vestiges of the Confederacy, the folk who were rebels, traitors, who literally turned on the country and wanted to keep people like you and me and many others in chains, enslaved, if you will. So we need this Department of Reconciliation. Tersely and laconically put, here's what it would do. It would have a Secretary of Reconciliation, very similar to the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Education, Secretary of the Treasury, and this secretary would report directly to the president. This secretary would have a mandate to develop a strategy and implement the strategy to eliminate racism and invidious discrimination. A part of this strategy, of course, would include people talking to each other, a truth-telling portion, if you will, a correction of history, if you will. I agree, you have to have dialogue, and that dialogue can lead to many good things. But we all understand at the inception, at the genesis of this process, that one of the good things that we want to get to will be the elimination of racism and invidious discrimination. This secretary would report to Congress semi-annually on the progress that's being made. This secretary would have a budget. The budget is linked to the budget of the Defense Department, not less than 10% of the budget of the Defense Department. Why the Defense Department? Because we will always fund the Defense Department. And because we don't want Congress to have the ability at some point in the future to starve the commission, the department, if you will, to death. We want to make sure that it continues because this is going to be, as I've indicated, a long-term process. I believe that this can be accomplished. I think with this Edmund Pettus Bridge moment, if we will take it upon ourselves, all of us, to ask that members of Congress support this. If you are familiar with a member of Congress, or if not, write members of Congress, call members of Congress, do the things that you know you can do to motivate members of Congress to do the things that can make a difference in the lives of people. This can be done because I believe members of Congress are sensitive to the issue now. This sensitivity having been heightened because of what happened to Mr. Floyd, what happened to Ms. Breonna Taylor, what happened to Ahmaud. Many people have been sensitized as a result of tragedies that have occurred as of late. I believe that with this sensitivity and with the bill being before Congress, the resolution is before Congress now, Resolution 992, as Mr. Bledsoe has indicated, Attorney Bledsoe, if you will. I believe that the bill which I am crafting, that will be presented to the Congress, I think it can be passed. And if we pass it, this will be the means by which we can have the momentum that has metamorphosed into a movement that can now become a part of a department so that it can be sustained for a good amount of time. Let me say this as I wrap up. There is good reason to do this, and the panelists today have really laid the predicate for it. You have laid a great foundation for what we are about to do. But I just want to mention a few things more that I did not hear, but that are exceedingly important that this department would address. It would address what happened in Tulsa. There has not been justice brought to the descendants and, of course, the people who were the victims of what happened in Tulsa. This was one of the greatest tragedies in American history in Tulsa. It ought to be reconciled. We have to settle our differences. And the Tulsa incident is one that must be addressed. But it would go beyond Tulsa. It would deal with the convict leasing that took place after the Civil War. This convict leasing in Texas was something that allowed corporations, businesses to benefit from persons who were incarcerated on minor offenses, worked them from dawn until dusk. Many of them were literally worked to death. It would allow for us to reconcile. These persons, some of them were manifested in Sugar Land just recently. There was a common grave with 95 bodies in it. We now know them as the Sugar Land 95. They were victims of the convict leasing program here in Texas. There are many such incidents such as this that we have to address. We have to correct history. We have to make it perspicuously clear to people that it is time for us to move on, but moving on cannot be accomplished in toto without our having the opportunity to reconcile, and we can't reconcile without the opportunity to have the truth told, and the truth cannot be told unless people have a platform on which they can stand to speak truth to power and also speak truth about power. It's not just a matter of telling power what the truth is. You have to talk about power when you bring out some of these truths. And I believe that this can be accomplished. Mr. Bledsoe, you have been absolutely outstanding. And the members of the panel, I do commend you and I salute you. And my hope is that we can work together, Mr. Bledsoe. I'd love to talk to many of the panelists about how to proceed with this. I don't claim any intellectual prowess that would allow me to do this without the aid and assistance of the intellectuals that you have.
Of the intellectuals that assistance 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 of the intellectuals that assistance.
We're back. I'll charge all of this to technology such that we may continue.
Does happen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bledsoe. I'll just be very brief and say thank you, and thank you to the panelists. I was about to say that I would enjoy having the assistance of as many of these intellectuals as possible, so as to make this one of the best possible results that we could possibly craft with the human minds. Thank you.
That's great. I'll ask you one question, maybe to elaborate on what you're doing. I think we heard from both Dr. Odesolu and Dr. Burton about how important discussion is, our dialogue. And we know that there was an attempt with President Clinton with Truth and Reconciliation, but they kind of backed down in that situation. Is it going to be possible, or can we help you to make it possible to get strident groups to come together and start having some dialogue in this country? Because I know that there will be some resistance, even though we've seen a change in public attitudes. I think that there would still probably be a need from the community around you to help you to move some of the forces that are obstacles to getting a real discussion going.
Well, thank you for the question. The Honorable Barbara Lee has a resolution that calls for this type of dialogue. I would defer to her and would assist her, because I think that what we are doing with the department complements what she's doing, as she would promote dialogue now. The department would extend that dialogue indefinitely, ad infinitum, if you will. Also, this complements what the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee has done, and moving reparations forward. All of these things complement each other. And I assure you, I would be more than honored to work with you and others so as to facilitate the dialogue. I think that dialogue at first glance appears to be an impossibility. But when you really get down to what Reverend Barbara is preaching, you understand that many people who don't look alike have similar circumstances. And I think we have to get people to start to understand that while we may appear to be different, our circumstances are so similar that we have issues that we should resolve, not only as they relate to us individually, but also as a group. Poor white people have reason to want to be a part of this reconciliation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Congressman. I know you've been able to reach across the aisle. I can just remember the time when you were able to get that earmark of $72 million for Texas Southern University. So where you had to reach across the aisle where the majority was on the other side. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate all of your efforts and look forward to working with you. Thank you so much for what you do. And so we'll move forward now. We've got a great discussion now, Congressman. So I know you'll have to go back, but if your staff wants to stay on, I think there may be some real worthwhile things about to come up. And in fact, one of the experts who's been involved in the race debate at the United Nations this week will be on the next panel. So, but thank you so much for taking this valuable time and giving it to us. It was such a pleasure to all of us to hear from you. We want to help you all that we can to advance your noble efforts. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Rodriguez.
We need to welcome in Dominique Day and Taclisha Blanchard, and thank you, Congressman. We really appreciate you. I think to bring in we have like 3 other people coming in, so if you're going to stay, Professor Bledsoe, okay, the Congressman is now gone, so I'm going to eject him completely so the others can come in. And Professor Bledsoe, if you're going to stay, that's fine, because now the Congressman is gone. Let's try to be timely in the next panel. Dominique, all right, he's gone, so we have to give Dominique Day. Coming in the conference right now would be Taclisha Blanchard, Dominique Day, Victor Good, and Carol Robinson. They all should have received a link, and I hope that I'm seeing Dominique Day. Dominique Day, you're in right now. Your microphone is on. If you bring in your video.
So sorry.
Oh, wonderful. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
I'm not sure if the Professor Bledsoe, because in this panel, you are the moderator, and so is Taclisha Blanchard. I believe Professor Bledsoe is just going to welcome you guys, and I'm going to check myself out and help the other people to come in. So I hope I get to chat with you guys again.
Sure, that's good. You can stay, and I can bow, Doctor. If you
No. Since I do not know Miss Dominic Day as well as you do, so why not introduce him at least first? And if the space is there, I think you can stay once you make sure you give them the podium. So
Okay.
I'm gonna block myself and I'll bring the other guests in. Thank you so much, Dominic Day. And
No,
listen,
thank
I
you.
can say your website is truly phenomenal. I have to copy from it.
Oh,
Love it.
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Are we going to have Miss Blanchard on? I
So,
thought he said Miss Blanchard.
I'm gonna bring them in, but you can continue the conversation as I bring them in. Okay?
Okay. I thought Miss Blanchard was going to do the introductions, but I would be more than happy to do that.
is it easier if I do it actually? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Oh no, I
No.
invited you because
If you're prepared to do the introduction, Dominic Day, you can take it over.
I can definitely introduce you,
Right.
and if Miss Blanchard wants to add some things later, then that's great too. Um, I was one of the individuals that helped put on the conference on the leadership of Fareed Muhammad back in last September at the United Nations to try to improve relations between historically black colleges and universities in the United States of America and publicly black, predominantly black institutions in this country with African universities and universities in the Caribbean. And we had a 2-day conference, and I was so happy to be part of the conference the day that Dominique Day spoke. Now, she is a lawyer and a litigator, so she has some of the experiences that I do or other lawyers in this country do. But one of the things that fascinated me was I found out a whole new realm about the United Nations and what the United Nations can do and what it has the authority to do. And she is designated as an expert on race for the United Nations. And there are various circumstances under which entities or governmental entities or individuals can invoke the authority of the United Nations and actually have the United Nations and various of their experts, like Ms. Day, to go around and conduct investigations. And so it's so timely now in the sense that she's actually gone around this country and around the world to conduct investigations relating to police misconduct and things of that nature, as we see what happened with Mr. Floyd, Mr. Arbery, and others that in this country, Mr. Brooks. It goes on and on and on in terms of individuals who have had these kinds of problems in this country. And this week, no doubt precipitated by the George Floyd matter, the murder in this country of Mr. Floyd, that's created this worldwide discussion that maybe will help us change the world. So she's been part of a debate this week at the United Nations on race. And so I think that's extremely significant that she has been part of that discussion. So I will let me say one more thing, and I will bow out, and then I can allow Ms. Blanchard to say a couple of things about Ms. Day, because she's going to be the moderator of the panel. But who's just joined us is Taclecia Blanchard. Ms. Blanchard is an extraordinary law student. She's one of those individuals who's a born leader. She was the president of her 1L class at the law school, and she has recently been elected as the president of the Student Bar Association at the law school. And she actually has time to go out and train individuals who run track. And so I'm impressed. I don't know if she has age limits, but I may get her to train me. But I can use some more speed. But anyway, so she's a person extraordinary, a great leader, and she's going to help moderate this discussion because we're trying to let young lawyers know, law students and undergraduate students, what some of the things are that you can do in law. And I'm just completely fascinated by what Miss Day is doing. I think it's like almost like being a professional athlete. I mean, it's the kind of thing you would just want to do, right? It just seems like, wow, if you're going to have a consequential legal career, Dominique Day has it. But Ms. Blanchard, let me turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Dean
Thank you for
Bledsoe.
those kind words, though. Let me just say that. It's very, very kind. Thank you.
You blew me away along with the others in the audience when you made that presentation.
Thank you, Dean Bledsoe. I appreciate that introduction as well. Dominic Day, I mean, I cannot follow the dean with that introduction. He spoke very highly of you, as well as myself. And, working with the UN and as an attorney yourself, you've been able to grapple with some of the social issues that we're experiencing and the things that we're seeing here today. Can you tell us about your career and how it has helped effectuate some of that change? And maybe for some of our viewers that might be interested in following a similar path.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to Clisha, and also thank you to the Dean. And I just want to say for a second, what a privilege it is to join you here today and to be invited. There are a few things that I personally benefit more from and just am nourished by than being in community with Black folk and with people who are really about it. And this is a real gift for me. So I hope you understand that. So I've been practicing for about 20 years, and currently, I sit on what's called the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, which is an independent body that conducts fact findings around the world and then reports on anti-Black racism to the UN Human Rights Council and to the public. And that's one piece of what I do. I also do some litigation. I also do a good amount of training and technical assistance, and also helping people plan around what it looks like to really identify and mitigate systemic racism in their spaces, and really try to pitch in wherever possible. So I actually appreciated, although I have no coordination or speed whatsoever, I appreciated the professional athlete reference, because for me, just aligning all of my work with the things I'm passionate about, which is racial justice, it's taken a lot of years, but it means I wake up ready to go, passionate, thinking about it. And both my personal life and my professional life are integrated in a way that is really amazing for my brain, right? So let me, but before this, right, I went to law school, obviously. I clerked for a year for a federal judge. I became a public defender. I did that for about 4 years. And then I wanted more, and I think that's maybe something I would like to share with the students on this call, which is that for some people, the law is a job, and they really believe in it. They believe that it holds something that's inherently true. I think for a lot of Black folk, we understand that the law is a tool, and that it's a way for us to show up in the struggle. It's a way for us to show up for each other. And it's a way for us to push the mainstream, to push the spaces where we see racism, where we see oppression. It's a tool that we can use to reflect back, a mirror on mainstream society. So that's a different orientation. I really appreciated what Congressman Green had to say earlier about speaking truth to power and just being a truth teller generally. And so for me, it became clear very early on that I wanted to be a truth teller. And I'll just tell you this, that's not always so comfortable in the spaces where you work. And it's not always so comfortable for people who see themselves as champions on issues of race or champions on issues of progressivism, who aren't necessarily people of color or Black folk who are living it in a certain kind of way. But for me, I made a lot of choices to be able to both gain skills and to tell truth. And so I worked at some programs. I did different kinds of litigation. I wanted to build out my own understanding of both how to try a case. As a public defender, you do a lot of trials, you do a lot of direct, one-on-one, beginning to end cases. But then I also wanted to learn class actions and complex civil litigation. I did a lot of whistleblower and complex cases a little bit later on. And then I started doing a good amount of international work. I worked for the State Department as a rule of law advisor overseas. I worked in Iraq and Afghanistan and Palestine, looking at how to build legal institutions and access to justice as mechanisms of conflict resolution. That not only were these the framework by which a society could live, but that also it's a way to resolve conflict and build durable peace. And now I do a good amount of work on mitigating anti-Black racism here in the US and internationally through the UN. And as Dean Bledsoe was saying, we've just concluded a kind of interesting arc at the UN around what it looks like for the UN to consider intervening around systemic racism in the US. And I can talk more about that later if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, with all that said, you sound like Superwoman. So we applaud you and all of your efforts. Because we need people such as yourself to continue to push the envelope and understand what is going on, the things that you've lived. And that kind of brings me to my next question. You talked about telling truth and that not being so easy. What about that balance about telling the truth as you see it, as you know it, as you've lived it, but yet jeopardizing your career? How does that work?
I mean, that's real for me. I think there are people who can watch the wrong things happen, or there are people who can live inside of milquetoast commitments to justice. And I'm probably not that person, for good or for ill. I was telling somebody on a webinar the other day that as a child, I used to get grounded a lot for really nothing. I really didn't ever do anything wrong. But like one of the times, my father and I were arguing about Biko versus Mandela, right? And at this point, this is, before you were born, to cliche, but, Mandela was still in jail. Steve Biko had been killed. South Africa was still under apartheid. And we were having this drag out war. And I was on the Biko side and he was on the Mandela side, probably also a little bit on the Biko side, but wanted me to be on a side that was more reform oriented. And on some level, right, like it ended with him showing me that he had power and grounding me. But that argument and that struggle around what those tactics look like and who and where we tell truth has complexity to it. Because of course, fast forward 10 years and you have Mandela, who miraculously does a thing no one ever thought was possible and creates the miracle of South Africa today and really changes the world in these fundamental ways. And so for me, being a truth teller, sometimes it's more about listening and about really taking in information and constantly and rigorously reevaluating what I know and what I don't know. And then also choosing where you speak out. So I think for law students, for young folk, the most important thing you can do is gain the skills, learn how to try a case, learn what policy looks like, read the documents, anything you're interested in, consume it like food, and really build out your skills, because at some point, and it's sooner than you think, you will have opportunities to be in a conversation. You will have opportunities to influence a conversation, and you may have opportunities to walk away from some place where they might really miss you for what it is you had to contribute. And so I think there's this sort of dual thing. Like if you see yourself as a truth teller, if you see yourself as wanting to be in the struggle in a long-term way, the first thing you have to do is put on your armor. You have to learn everything you can learn, even from people who may not want to teach, or even from spaces that may not always see us for all of what we are. But you need to see yourselves, right? We need to do a good job of seeing ourselves and uplifting each other. But at the same time, once you have those skills, the dexterity you have inside of struggle, the dexterity you have inside of spaces that will try to delegitimize us, is phenomenal. And I bet Dean Bledsoe, may relate to this, but there's a series of things that get said to, especially women of color, all the time. Oh, you're so good with the clients. That means you don't really know the law. You don't necessarily have good strategy, but the clients like you because you're Black and they feel good about that. And you talk a certain way that makes them feel some kind of way. And they'll say that even in the face of groundbreaking legal work. And these are conversations I have with my Black women friends, even now, we're 20 or so years in. And so understanding that there is an undercurrent of racism and delegitimization that you're going to find everywhere, and that you don't actually need to take that in. Just like your whole life, you've been deciding what you take in and what you don't take in. But what you do need to do is get the skills that you need to be in the struggle the way you want. That's what's really important. That's what's really important. I may have lost track of the question a little bit.
Oh, no, you definitely did well, because my buildup was to ask how to maneuver in that space, not only as a woman, but as a Black woman, especially in a male-dominated field. Going back to your initial point about speaking truth, we don't want to hide the truth. We definitely want to be boisterous in doing so. How, though? How would you recommend a student or a young lawyer prepare to maneuver in that space?
So I think it's two things, right? I think number one, seek feedback wherever you can get it. Every time somebody tears apart a draft of yours, they're doing you a favor. Think about why they're thinking the way they're thinking. Think about how people structure their arguments. Think about what is persuasive when you hear it, right? So seek feedback. But the other side of that, and I'll be super honest, is build your resilience, because the world is not kind to us in the ways it is kind to others. And the world doesn't see us as human and as vulnerable and as needing of consideration. And so that's something we do for each other. So number one, you figure out who can see you for your potential, and who are the people you're trying to prove that you're good enough. The people who can see you, these are people you can trust. And these are spaces where you can grow, and spaces where you can learn in a whole different way. And sometimes you're in a space where you know they can't see you. You know that you have that feeling in your stomach that you're showing up and giving 150%, but you're being seen as less than. And that's not a space you need to walk away from, but that's a space you need to be very clear on what you're getting from it. Because the people who can't see you may never see you. And that can't be a metric of your self-worth. It can't be a metric of your happiness. Then it certainly can't be a metric of your suitability to live the dream you want to live. And that's what I think, especially Black students, especially Black women, really need to hold on to. This idea of excellence as a lawyer cannot be linked to this idea of who you are and your validity as a person or as a professional in the world. Because I think it's more active than you realize that people will deny us the kind of validation we're entitled to. Sometimes we even deny it to ourselves, right? And people will see us as machines, as automatons, as people willing to work 24/7. And it's really our job to try to uplift each other, but also to remember that we are here to learn, and we are here to mobilize what we learn towards an incredibly important struggle that we're taking steps every day. And so I guess my answer to your question is, you almost, maybe it's a version of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, right? You need to disaggregate sort of what you're doing in your professional spaces, what you're learning from them, what you're able to gain, even from people who are your least charitable editors. You need to separate that from the ways in which you nurture your soul and your spirit, and the ways in which you show up for the struggle, and the ways in which you can hear people who see what you have to offer. And you can find people who see what you have to offer. For me, with a lot of, especially young Black lawyers, they don't get that second part in their workplaces. And that's not their fault, but it's incredibly important to remember that's not about you. That's about the ways in which our social conditioning operates to deny us what we should have, to deny us the mentoring, to deny us the validation, to deny us the community in these spaces. And so that's something we have to find on our own. But that is absolutely separate from building the skills, which you can get from toxic and abusive colleagues, to be honest, right? The more someone is critical, the more you're being given tools to improve your practice, to improve your trade. But you gotta tend to your soul also. And maybe one more thing is to remember how important each and every one of you is, how needed each and every one of you is. We don't have enough for this impossible fight that we're in. And your generation is already making a difference. Look around right now, right? The sensitivity of your generation has led to uprisings around the world right now. And so we need you, and we need you to protect who you are, but we also need you to learn the skills and learn all the skills.
Absolutely. Thank you for that response. I think I had a conversation recently with a classmate, and we discussed opportunities in the legal field as it pertains to externships, internships, just volunteering yourself as a student. And something my grandfather always told me is to never leave a place without learning something. And I was very young when he said that. I was working at Target and I was folding clothes in the women's department. And I'm like, I already know how to fold clothes. I can leave. But there was something bigger. There was something more. And it wasn't until I grew up and I matured that I understand that. And I think that's what you're saying about understanding your metric is yours, and you don't have to measure yourself against other people. You go in a place, whether it's toxic or not, you learn something before you go, whether that means you be more sensitive the next place you go, or you're not as you don't wear your heart on your sleeve, maybe the next place you go, whatever that lesson is that you learn, to learn something. And I think the externship opportunity allows students to sharpen their swords and groom themselves prior to getting into this dog eat dog world. And so just as a student leader and someone who has had several internships, I recommend all students and people who maybe not students, if you're interested in a new field, to explore that field and understand what it is that it takes to be a part of that field. So that much is very appreciated from your standpoint. I want to talk about writing. You talked about skills, and we're talking about careers in law that make a difference. We understand the way in which we communicate is important. That is also very important as an attorney. Can you speak about the importance of and how to develop that skill? Because so many years removed from law school, maybe you're not such a new attorney. How can you keep that skill sharp for your colleagues to take you equally as serious and not just, oh, you work so well with the client?
Well, I have to tell you, I don't get that anymore. I don't get that you're so good with the client stuff anymore, but it's because I really developed a strong set of litigation skills. Well, I don't know, who knows what it's because, to be honest, you can't really disaggregate people's racism. But I will say this, learning how to write as a lawyer, I think it's one of the best things you can do. And but it's tough. A lot of people talk about folks in your generation not accepting track changes well, not accepting edits well, and that's a major barrier, because the reality is I didn't grow up with lawyer parents. Very few of us did, and it's actually incredibly important to constantly be getting feedback about your own work. So there's some great books out there. There's a book called Point Made that I really like. It sort of talks about how to structure a narrative argument. I think there's probably other books as well. And so that can be helpful, how to make that argument. What I tell younger lawyers and what I do for myself, sort of like I was saying earlier, I think it's important to be a truth teller. One of the things I want to do is I want to center Black and Brown realities in my own litigation advocacy. So a lot of people will start by reading the cases, and maybe when you're a younger lawyer, you should do that. I try to start by figuring the facts and thinking about what happened here, what's the outrage, and then letting the law support the outrage as I understand it to the community. Sometimes so some of it is writing, but some of it is perspective, really saying like, I personally think you win cases on the law and not the facts. And so I think you actually need to put together a very tough, factual, rigorous package. And that can be really difficult for law students to learn, how to match the facts to the law, how to adduce the facts inside of the law. Not all judges write about it well. So I think just developing an understanding of how to write up the facts in a persuasive, tight way, almost like you would tell it to a friend, can be really powerful. And the way I often do that, believe it or not, is I often tap into something to decolonize my mind. I might watch Beyonce's Homecoming. I might watch, there's a TV show that John Legend was involved with around enslavement called maybe Underground. Was that what it was called? There was anything that's taking place centering Black agency, centering us as agents of our own survival and as agents of our own creativity. I will watch something that has nothing to do with the law just to recenter myself in us as survivors, us as resilient, us as agents, instead of us as victims. And that's the first thing I try to do, to really decolonize my brain and get away from this legal system, which often looks at us as a problem to be solved, rather than an integral part of viable democracy, right? So that's the first thing. And then I think about, okay, what are these facts saying? What makes sense? What doesn't? What gives me a stomach ache of discomfort? And those are the spaces where I make the arguments, right? Those are the spaces where I take the factual argument and build out an outline. And then I typically look for the ways that the law can support the arguments I want to make on behalf of our communities. And obviously, it's not a linear process like this, but I think for writing, especially for young law students, a lot of the challenge is figuring out how to really bring the facts in and let the facts drive the argument, not letting the legal cases drive the argument. The legal cases should be in support of the fact patterns that matter.
Right, right. That's so true. You know, as a 1L, adjusting to legal writing was very difficult. You know, just writing in undergrad, I didn't have to think about it. Just write, I'll get an A. I really had to focus and try to understand what was being asked of me and to develop that skill. And it's not an easy one, which is why, you know, the field is only for those who go to law school. However, what I learned, because I speak, right? I do public speaking and things of that nature. So I engulfed myself in some of the intramural competitions. I did mock trial, moot court, things of that nature. And I had to argue my point in the moot court competition. I had to convey my point in the mock trial, and it came easy as pie to me. And it clicked. A light bulb went off that the same thing I'm doing orally is what I'm expected to do on paper. And it took me doing that and taking myself outside of that element, so to speak, kind of what you were mentioning, for me to say, aha, here's my epiphany, here's my moment that, oh, this is what you want. You know, so I do think that's important, which brings me to another question. All this amazing work that we're doing in the legal field, we talk about branding and we talk about balance. How do you balance your work life and your social life, if there is one? I hear so many people say, I don't have a how do you balance that?
Let me, and maybe this is also an implicit answer to your question, let me add one thing from the prior point, which is that I think another thing for us to remember is the sources of authority. We may have to shift those sometimes. So when I'm talking about race, the law is not as good as it should be, right? We've seen a really undercutting of racial justice law in a while, but we're seeing much more good authority from things like social psychology, which is very authoritative, it's scientific. And so for me, I think it's also important to look for the credible authority that actually helps us. And I bring that into my briefing all the time. Balance questions are really hard for me. I absolutely love working. I work a lot. So my UN work is unpaid, but it's full-time. So I have a full-time job there. And I also do full-time work to live in my teeny New York City apartment. But I also find that, you know, when I do, right, like I'll go out tonight, like when I do actually, I mean, I'm not really supposed to be going out because it's quarantine, so don't say that. But, you know, like what I find is that I'm filled with energy and filled with light in a way that I didn't used to be on a Friday. Before I was able to align my work with my interests and my passions. And so I think the balance comes a bit easier when you really integrate who you are with what you care about. And I think it's a struggle for us, right? Like there's a lot of freedom. It took me many, many years, right, to both develop those skills and to really create a space where my work could really match my passions. But for me, that's actually created a balance that's not as good hours-wise as it should be. But I think I show up for people in my life in a much more like thoughtful and considerate way and kind way than when I was sort of at a law firm and, you know, litigating, and I'd come home and be ranting about whatever. So I think part of good balance is really feeding and nourishing your soul with your work. If you're that person where your work is really close to your identity. I think for a lot of us, I think I think this is just the nature of being Black in America, right? We were told, like, we work, we buckle down, we focus, and that really became part of our identity. So I really envy these people who like see their 9 to 5 as, you know, a thing that they could do or not do. I don't know that many Black people who don't feel some sense of identity in the work that we do. And I think that's beautiful, but probably probably a psychologist would tell us that we're all completely unbalanced anyway, too.
I think you're right. So, talking about engulfing yourself in the work that you do and that just being a part of who you are, can you speak to us more about your work with the UN as we commemorate Juneteenth?
Yeah. So maybe I can start with what's happened now. So I sit on the working group of experts of people of African descent. And part of what we do is conduct these fact-finding investigations around the world, like Dean Bledsoe was saying. This week, after George Floyd, after protests erupted around the world, sustained protests in London and Canada, right, all over the place, where people were not only showing solidarity with the US, but also really speaking to their local concerns and the ways in which police brutality was showing up in their lives. The Africa group, the African nations, approached the Human Rights Council and demanded a session on systemic racism by law enforcement in the United States. And so this unprecedented session took place over the last few days and included what they called an urgent debate in which both member states and civil society and independent experts were able to offer interventions around the nature of systemic racism in the US and around the world, and the ways in which the UN could or should intervene. In advance of that, several of these mandates, including ours, had issued statements and calls to action. We had issued statements, so the working group had issued statements that was joined by maybe 25 other experts, remarking how similarly the situation of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd resembled a modern day lynching, how the actual criteria for lynching, racial terror, groups of people chasing Black folk, conducting torture, killing, racial epithets, standing over people's body, kicking them, right? These criteria, if you look at lynching, if you look at the EJI lynching report, for example, you see how seamlessly the criteria for racial terror lynching are being met in these modern day actions by both law enforcement and quasi law enforcement, right? Ahmaud Arbery wasn't killed by the police, but he was killed by people who were both deputized, emboldened, and then covered up by the police.
Right.
And so this urgent debate, so we had issued some statements, which is a lot of what we do at the UN, is issue some statements. We had issued these statements and we've been pushing in our spaces, and the Africa group was outraged at what is happening to Black bodies and saw this as a moment to really step forward and demand more. So the urgent debate took place. And I will say this, we're not happy about the outcome entirely, but if I never thought in my lifetime I would sit and watch 6 hours of proceedings in the Human Rights Council where state after state after state is saying Black Lives Matter, where people are calling for a commission on inquiry, where people are acknowledging the systemic racism that exists in our countries. In some cases, countries where we've done country visits and not seen much focus on our recommendations for how to mitigate racism. Some of these countries acknowledged that and committed to do more. So as a Black woman who's part of Generation X, and who didn't necessarily believe that a bureaucracy that large and that grounded in what sometimes feels like a very neo-colonial dynamic, right? The ways in which certain countries continue to command outsized force is not a small thing inside the UN or just geopolitically, right? But to see this debate was transformational and really, really important. It's available. It's available on UN TV if anybody wants to watch, and you can see what your states did. In the end, typically there's a resolution that's an outcome of these debates, right? And there had been a hope that there would be a commission on inquiry, that there would be basically a fact-finding investigation in the US and elsewhere of the ways in which systemic racism shows up in law enforcement. And there was some great hope that there would be a commission on inquiry, or that there would be at least a call to establish facts, that there would be operational language that was active enough to trigger the need to both fund and support real investigative solutions, insofar as that's the thing the UN can do. Nobody really expects the UN to send peacekeepers into the US, but I think we wanted more than just statements. And there was tremendous political pressure. We've maybe I can put it in the chat. We issued a statement just this morning, both commenting on Juneteenth, commenting on the tremendous pressure that the African nations were under to abandon the most active parts of the resolution, and the ways in which very powerful countries, especially Western countries, despite the words they may have said in the council, were demanding and putting much pressure to have the Africa group pull back anything active in the resolution as the condition of consensus. And so we actually also called for the Human Rights Council to abandon consensus, to have a yes or no vote. Our working group, and we joined with the Special Rapporteur on Racism, we said, you know what, consensus on a diluted, watered down resolution, maybe it's actually better to have an up or down vote and people can show where they stand on the strong original resolution that was presented. And then it'll be on the record and it'll be clear. So we called for that. That did not happen. Instead, the Human Rights Council passed the consensus resolution, which still contains a lot of very important and good language. It calls for a report to be written about systemic racism in the US and elsewhere. It calls for mandates like ours to be consulted in that process. And hopefully we can build out some structure and hopefully some resources to get that a little bit staffed. Because as I've said, our work is unpaid. And so we donate quite a lot of time, but as you may know, that's a struggle, right? Like, we already donate basically a full-time space and we'll make whatever time we have to make. Don't get me wrong, but we would like the UN to take this seriously enough to give it some funding and to really resource it appropriately. So we didn't actually get the resolution that we wanted out of this, but the debate itself is unprecedented and transformational. And, you know, if you're a student of history, you may recall that in 1946, W.E.B. Du Bois, just to circle right back there, and the NAACP went to the UN and asked the UN, the brand new UN, to do something to help the situation of Black folk in the US. And at that time, the US was strongly against it. And in fact, the US suggested that one of the problems with even getting on board with the United Nations was that the Negro problem would all of a sudden become of international interest. Eleanor Roosevelt, whom we consider to be a hero of human rights, and she is, even though she sat on the board of the NAACP at the time, did not support this for political or other reasons. And ultimately, the petition brought forth by W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP was ignored, was dismissed. So, you know, if in fact there is the arc of justice, at least today, we saw a rigorous debate, we saw commitments, we saw many states demanding the Commission on Inquiry, but we also saw in the end that the resolution that we got maybe could have been stronger in terms of operations. Maybe that's more than you wanted to hear.
Oh, it's perfect. Thank you. And we look forward, if you're able to find the link, that you can put it in the chat for the viewers.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, how can students, maybe not students, maybe just people in general, how can they get involved? Do you have to be an attorney to be as involved as you are? Are there sub-organizations that people can involve themselves in? That way they can help with the change.
Yeah. So for us, if you're very interested in exactly this space, we do a lot of work with and are lobbied by civil society. So a lot of the civil society organizations you know about, US Human Rights Network and others, are really working with us very actively and often pushing us, which is great. There's sometimes internship opportunities. Sorry, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, excuse me, also conducts a fellowship for people of African descent every year. But I think you have to be like mid-career for that. I don't think it's a young student thing. We conduct events. I mean, you guys are in Texas, right? But there's events in New York. So we have two sessions. One is a public session that we are now hoping to webcast regularly from Geneva, but we're also hoping to start doing more in New York. So we're in New York every October to report to the General Assembly, and we conduct events there that can be viewed or attended. But then also our thematic public session. So last year it was on data for racial justice. This year it was supposed to be on environmental racism and the climate crisis for people of African descent to really shine what that looks like for us, because that's just not been in the conversation as much. That was supposed to take place in March, but it looks like, but obviously that didn't happen. And it looks like we may, the COVID and everything that's been happening, we may actually shift the topic, but it's planned to take place in December. So that'll be webcast. And then we really enjoy working with folk who want to sort of work with us. And so there's a variety of ways, obviously.
Well, thank you. I want to ask another question before we wrap up and go to the next panelist. As someone who is so involved, an attorney, someone who's lived, you've seen other instances besides George Floyd and besides Ahmaud Arbery and besides Breonna Taylor. This is not new, unfortunately. What do you think about this particular time is waking people up, is getting people involved? From a legal aspect, the laws have been here. They've been misapplied for many years. What now is the reason, in your opinion?
I think that's a really excellent question. To me, it's not that people are waking up now. To me, it's step by step by step. So on some level, right, in Minneapolis, because there's been all this organizing since Philando Castile, this whole space of organizing and of really pushing for what it is that they want, what it is that works and doesn't work, that created a really quick response with both mutual aid, community defense, and clear goals. The minute the George Floyd tragic video went live, right? We didn't just have to sit in our discomfort. I'm sure you were just like me, just sitting there reeling, but we also had real tools to draw on. And so I think that's part of it, like building out the tools. I think another part of it, up until a couple of weeks ago, I was working on the NYPD stop and frisk case all day, every day. And I think that a lot of these spaces, you really see the limitations of what the reform and millions of dollars of reform have been able to do. And I think that recognition has also really changed a conversation about abolition and about defund that probably couldn't have happened 20 years ago. But now we have many, many police departments under consent decrees, and yet the impunity, like in New York City, right? There's a post-trial judgment that's been in place, and there's this remedial process, and yet you see the police beating people on the street. You see the police commissioner defending that. And so the impunity in the face of all of these reform efforts, I think that does actually change the conversation. So to me, this is all part of the struggle. It's a long-term thing. I hope, but don't expect, we'll get everything that we want in this moment. But I think it's about us showing the durability and the commitment to continue building out and demanding more every time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I definitely will make sure all of my colleagues and classmates hear such profound words. We appreciate your time. If
thank you.
Get us that link. Hopefully we'll be able to get you, aside from COVID, maybe we can get you on campus and you can speak to some of the students and some of those incoming students as well about these careers in the law that are so impactful. And speaking on such a day such as today that is so impactful is wonderful as well. So we thank you so much for your time.
No, for me as well. Thank you all so much. It's such a privilege to be here. Mr. Rodriguez, if you don't kick me out right away, I'll turn my camera off, but I can put some links in the chat in the next couple minutes.
Oh, that's great. We may have another question to the thing what Dr. Rodriguez says. Dr. Rodriguez, what do you have for us?
Dr.
You have Mr. Good. Okay, great. Well, you guys should meet each other, and you're supposed to be on the same panel, so maybe you can stay.
I can stick around.
That'd be real good. Mr. Good, the next panelist, has always been interested in utilizing the United Nations as a segue for advancing civil rights. So, could you tell us? Answer one question. If you have an issue, for example, you live in a community.
Professor Bledsoe, hold on. We don't have a minute longer. We have to make a hard stop because the hard stop is required because we have a hard stop at 2:45. Dominic Day, if we can come back at the intermission break, we'll be back at 3:05. We have Dr. Arikana Shambori-Kwo, the ambassador of the African Union, the previous ambassador, She'll be coming on at 3:05 as a guest, and then in that panel, if you're available, you can come back in the panel number 3 along with Victor Good from the NAACP, because we only now got him in, but we have to make a hard stop to get the system reboot, record the first session, and then come back on. So if you can,
you guys need to meet, you and Victor for sure. So
no, Victor will be back. I mean, I think Victor.
We got a chance to talk yesterday,
to Miss Day.
so we're cool now. Oh, I shouldn't say that anymore.
So listen,
And
our
by the way,
viewers,
Ms. Blanchard, Victor is an alum of Thurgood Marshall.
Yes, we
Yeah.
spoke yesterday as well.
our viewers who've been watching us,
Yeah,
for the-
Dr. Rodriguez, it's your show. You take it.
right?
over.
So we're gonna still continue. Our keynote will be Dr. Arikana Shimbori. Of course, she'll be coming in the next 20 minutes. Once we hard stop, we have to literally wait for 20 minutes for the system to record and it's encoded, and we'll come back in. So Dominic Day, I hope we get to have you back. Felicia Blanchard and Victor Good, we are so apologetic that you have been a true trooper. He has been out there since early today trying to make it work. But you see, perseverance, he didn't give up on it. So we know how to connect. So in the panel number 3, we have the ambassador speak. We have Regent Price, Gary Bledsoe, and Dr. Anthony Rodriguez. I'm in there. So Dominic Day and Victor Good, we'll see you then. So everyone, please take a break, get some coffee, some tea, some juice, and we'll be soon back. Thank you very much.
And Ms. Blanchard, thank you so much. You did a tremendous job, as we all knew. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
We'll be back 20 minutes.
Hey, thanks. I'm